Hi, everyone. Welcome to Biohabitats' first Habitat Happy Hour. I'm Amy Nelson. I'm a member of the communications team at Biohabitats. I'm really excited to kick off these Habitat Happy Hours. There was a little bit of confusion about the start time, so for those of you who signed on early, thank you so much for hanging with us. These Habitat Happy Hours, what we're hoping to do is really share information, inspiration, and really good discussion around the theme of biodiversity. And for those of you who are joining us from the western parts of the US or really from any time zone other than Eastern where we are, I realize that this may not actually be the ideal happy hour time, but please know that we're grateful that you joined us, and some of our future Habitat Happy Hours will likely be later in the day. We're launching this Habitat Happy Hour with a 3-episode webinar about how we can use ecology as a foundation for the planning of equitable, biodiverse, and resilient cities. And presenting these webinars are two of my colleagues who've done exactly that type of work with cities like Atlanta, Kansas City, and Baltimore. Jennifer Dowdell is a senior ecological landscape planner and designer, and Jennifer's expertise is in integrating the principles of ecology, of landscape ecology, into design and master planning projects. Aiman Duckworth is a senior landscape architect and urban ecologist, and Aiman's expertise is in geospatial modeling and in the valuation of ecosystem services. In today's talk, Jennifer is going to introduce you to a process that she and Aiman use in approaching this type of work. And then in episodes 2 and 3, which will be on May 19th and June 2nd, they'll delve more deeply into the steps within for the process and the details of those steps. Whether you are sipping a cocktail or a cup of coffee right now, I raise a glass to all of you who are interested in protecting and enhancing biodiversity, and I will turn things over to Jennifer. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Amy, and thank you all for joining us today. So we're going to get started and just jump right in. First, though, I'd like to take a moment to pause and acknowledge that we gather today on traditional lands of Indigenous peoples in a variety of locations around the U.S. and abroad, and I'd like to pay my respect to the leaders, past and present, elders, and especially here where I am in the lands of the Piscataway and Susquehannock. So today, as Amy mentioned, this is the first of 3 episodes that we've developed to really explore our urban ecology design and planning process. And this is an inclusive urban design process that really is based in the braided narratives of ecology, history, and culture. And we're looking at this through the lens of landscape ecology and this foundation and community input to provide keys to designing for tomorrow's resilient cities. So in our first episode today, we'll really focus on establishing the context, getting started, thinking about storytelling and narrative, and grounding ourselves in ecology and biodiversity. And then in next episode, which will be in a couple of weeks, we'll dive much deeper into data analysis and steps of that process. And then finally, the plan as a living document, implementation and beyond in our third episode. So first, before we get started, we wanted to do a couple of quick polls to get a sense of who we have joining us today, where you come from, what your areas of expertise and practice are. So if Amy, you could do the first poll question, please, open it up. We'd like to hear from you whether or not, or what area of practice you come from. Is it public sector, private sector, nonprofit, or none of the above? So just take another moment to answer this question, and then we will allow just another minute, see if we can get 100% of you all to answer, so we can get a good sense of the breakdown of practice today. Okay, Amy, let's go ahead and close it. So we have about half of you join us from the private sector in the practice. A third of the respondents are with the public sector, 15% are with nonprofit, and then 10% of none of the above. I peeked at the registration list just this afternoon. It looks like we might have some students joining us, so welcome to you all. Great to have you here with us. So next question, Amy, if you could open the second poll, please. We want to understand a little bit about where you're coming from. Are you seeing increased interest in resiliency planning? And this is a simple yes or no. This would be from your constituents, your colleagues, local towns or councils where you live. We have a good response so far, but I'll give you another minute for everyone to take a minute to respond to this poll question. This helps us understand what your experience is and how this might be relevant to your work. All right, Amy, we'll give them another couple seconds to finish voting. And go ahead and close that poll if you could, please. So almost 100% of you responded that this is, yes, something that you're seeing increased in interest in. So that's great to hear. And then our final poll question is a multiple choice. We ask you to give us the top priority. So you can only choose one. Of the 5 here, what is the top priority defining the local planning work where you are or where you're practicing? So Amy will open up that poll so you all can participate. And I'll give you just a couple moments to complete this final poll. Okay, everybody's voting. Thank you very much. I'll give you another couple seconds to fill in your response. Again, you'll only be able to choose the top. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing you're working on, but we want to kind of see where the priorities are landing. Okay, Amy, I think we can go ahead and close this poll. So it's a nice split. And this is not surprising. It looks like almost 40% of you are seeing priorities in environment and sustainability. That might be biased by perhaps that we are an environmental sustainability firm and you may be aware of us for that reason. So perhaps that interest aligns with your interest in what we're doing. But I also see some response. 20% are seeing that priority in equity and access, and split 15% each for population growth and economic development, with 10% on transit, transportation, and trails. What's important, I think, to acknowledge at this moment is that all of these priorities are actually woven into this process, this urban ecology framework approach to urban planning. So all of them are relevant, all of them are addressed, but it is that we are looking through this socio-ecological lens in order to start to pull apart the opportunities for planning for a more resilient future in these cities. So thanks again for everyone in your participation of that polling activity. And we'll kind of keep all of that in mind as we get into the next series of slides. So today, we're going to really break down in the following outline of ideas that we'll start to delve into. We'll talk a little bit about our approach, then define urban ecology a bit more so we have that working context, why this and why now. And then importantly, as we get into the beginnings of the process, the starting steps, the importance of understanding the players, the stakeholders, the members of the teams and collaborators that we work with on these projects. It is not a siloed approach, it is the opposite. And then of course, we'll talk a little bit more about what does engagement look like? How does that fit into this ecological approach to urban planning and design? And how does that interweave in this early part of the process? So what is the process? So this is the approach. It looks to be sort of a stepwise approach, but it is actually quite iterative and can be circular as we continue to refer back to the things that we learn early on in the process. But today, in this first webinar of the 3, we'll really be focusing on these first 2 steps. The engaging the community and setting a vision and goals, and really understanding the impact and the importance of establishing a universal understanding of the narrative of a place, and the importance of both integrating data assessment into that and community stories. So it is a 6-step iterative process, and we'll really focus on these first 2 in more detail today. So as I've mentioned a couple times, this is a socio-ecological approach for really thinking, yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We are not seeing your screen.
Okay, let me make sure it is shared.
I know
Can
we
you
have
see
a
it now?
coming through the area. We can now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Let me just go back one slide to give us an illustration of that process so that we can kind of all see it, and then we can move into the discussion with more visuals. Thanks for letting me know, Amy. So again, it is a 6-step process, and we'll be focusing on these first 2 steps in getting started. So as I started to describe, this is a socio-ecological approach. It is systems thinking. It is multi-scalar. Even if we are thinking at the city scale, most of the time we are also thinking about the relationships to the regional scale and down to the neighborhood scale. It is thinking about the grounding ourselves in ecology and biodiversity and understanding the integration of community experience and needs. So this idea of storytelling place, or understanding our narrative relationship to place, is really about identity and our connection to our cities through an understanding of our shared identity with nature. And many of us, without even thinking, could name the natural features that define our relationship to our home cities: a creek, a harbor, a favorite patch of woodland, a majestic tree. We could perhaps draw from memory. And in some traditions, the connection to community and their ecosystems is even more explicit. When the Maori people of Aotearoa, New Zealand, formally introduce themselves, they begin by naming the boat that brought them to the country, followed by their mountain, their river, their marae, and their tribe. And this grounds individuals in both their cultural and family heritage, as well as their kinship to nature and responsibility as guardians of those landscapes. And the Maori have the people, and many indigenous people around the globe, they value and pass down these ancestral knowledge and relationships of patterns and processes and the rhythms of nature. And it is the same for us in understanding the opportunity to start with individuals' relationships and connections to place and to nature in the city, and using that as a guiding light for how we think about the urban planning process. So we are really focused on this idea of urban ecology. As I mentioned, this idea of nature as identity, or nature associated with public health, and the importance of understanding the value of biodiversity in the natural systems in our cities, and understanding the impacts and opportunities for improving equity and justice considerations. So we want to take just a minute to further explore urban ecology, and what does that mean, and what are the meanings that come from that we're applying to this work. So as has been discussed a lot in recent years, today over 50% of the world's populations live in urban areas, and that's expected to increase to almost 70% of the population in urban areas by 2050. So we have this important need to understand our relationship to and use of environmental resources while we all are living in these cities, and so that we understand we also have an impact on these systems, and that we rely on the benefits that urban ecological systems provide, as well as those ecological systems that exist outside of our cities. We have more reliance, actually, as the populations grow within the cities. And the Baltimore Ecosystem Study noted in their work that urban ecology is such an important realm of science for study and to inform planning, because ecology and urban ecology has an impact on our community's livability, including psychological benefits and human comfort. Ecological function is a source of many ecosystem services that our communities rely on. The intimate feedback loops among natural and human aspects of our cities, and the equity and the free ecological work available to social groups across our cities. So all of these contribute both to our health and wellness and the sustainability and resilience of our cities. So understanding our continued human reliance on resources as we think about city planning. And we also understand that in urban ecology, we're thinking about spectrums of function of these natural systems as they exist in our urban centers. They take a lot of different forms. They may have more core habitat and larger areas of forest or other types of natural resources that are more intact on one end of the spectrum. And on the other end of the spectrum, it is as important to understand the ecological value and function and potential benefit of individual street trees on a street. And then the various dynamics in between that of patches of vegetation or other types of natural functioning systems that we can embrace as part of our framework for city planning, for community health and wellness, and economic revitalization. That goes all the way into an understanding of our wildlife within the cities. There are opportunities for understanding integrated habitat function in our human settlement areas. And these species actually are examples of species we considered in their functionality and habitat when we did our work in Atlanta. So that there is the opportunity to understand our relationships and the reciprocity of uses and existence in our systems, and the appreciation of all the different members of our community. So why biodiversity as this central tenet as we think about urban ecology? E.O. Wilson noted that the loss of a keystone species is like a drill accidentally striking a power line. It causes the lights to go out. And that, I think, is the central idea behind the idea of embracing the importance of biodiversity as we think about urban systems and ecology, that we understand there are these trophic cascades, there are impacts when we lose a species. And if we care about biodiversity, it has cascading impacts and many different understandings of benefits that we enjoy for healthy living in our cities and relationships to these natural systems that are part of our cities. So we want to embrace all of that and have that as these kind of key underlying foundational tenets for looking at the ecosystems that are at the heart of our cities and that kind of spread throughout underneath of our feet and even sometimes underneath of the soil in our pipes, and understand our relationship and the reciprocity we can enjoy there and successfully hope to make more resilient for the future. So this is not the beginning of this work. It has been happening for a couple of decades. Different cities around the world have been doing work similar to this, looking to the green networks or the natural systems that underlie our cities to look for a fresh approach to support sustainability and resilience. As sustainability has become more of a front and center idea, these plans have started to grow in popularity. And we have examples from around the world. Here on the screen is Hamburg, Germany, and Kuala Lumpur, kind of a habitat connection, green connection plan for San Francisco. But there are also examples in Barcelona, Spain, Edmonton, Canada, Christchurch, New Zealand, Seattle, Houston, and even Portland and Vancouver. But there are further opportunities to expand on this and to create more opportunities around our country to really embrace the local native ecology and ecosystems as a way to help support stronger and more resilient cities. So in our work, and the focus of these 3 sessions will really be on our experiences in Baltimore, Maryland, and Atlanta, Georgia primarily, with some emphasis also on our work at the regional scale in Kansas City, Missouri. So in these projects, we will go through the kind of data analysis and the social and community engagement that help get us to the final plans for these projects. And dig a little deeper into how ecology and social and community well-being and interests and desires all inform these larger scale city planning efforts. So now, the community engagement, getting started on these sorts of projects. We are really thinking of our clients as collaborators. So frequently these projects, and in the examples of Atlanta and Baltimore, our client was the city planning department. But it wasn't just this kind of what might be considered a typical client consultant relationship. These were very collaborative, dialogue-heavy, discourse-laden discussions and approaches where we were collaborating and really starting to develop this as a team with those agencies, and then often with also input from perhaps the Office of Sustainability or regional planning groups, and some of the other agencies within the city network, like Parks and Rec, DPW, Department of Transportation. On the other side of the table, if you will, our teams, in these cases in Atlanta and Baltimore, we were the prime, but then we had fairly large multidisciplinary teams, making sure we had all of the right types of expertise at the table to ensure we were not doing some sort of siloed planning approach, but something very interdisciplinary and dialogue-centric on making sure all of the different elements were woven in holistically. So that includes everything from the Biohabitats team members, who would include landscape ecologists, landscape architects, water resources engineers, as well as other consultant team members, including further landscape architects, perhaps urban designers, transportation planners, trail planners, civil engineers, economic development experts, community engagement experts, potential funders, and even nonprofit conservation organizations, all part of our team in some cases, to allow to make sure we had a variety of voices and expertise that could make these plans very strong and really support resilience. Most importantly, though, was the process that we would go through in starting these projects with the city in developing the community engagement approach and thinking about the importance of making sure we had a wide net and a very inclusive approach to community engagement, not only through a robust meeting plan for just kind of general community meetings scattered across the city, ensuring we were touching all the neighborhoods or community groups, but also technical advisory panels and stakeholder advisory panels who could help broaden the conversation and the local expertise and input. So on this screen, we show just a series of bubbles that show the diversity of members of those technical and stakeholder advisory committees or panels for our Baltimore and Atlanta work. They're all kind of scattered across this slide, but you'll see a representation of everything from federal agencies to state and local agencies and organizations, nonprofit groups, universities, and other research consortiums, and local stakeholder nonprofit groups. So a variety of voices that are actively engaged throughout the process, starting at the beginning, and then continuing to revisit these groups to get a feedback loop established. This is just an example slide pulled from our work in Baltimore. These were the partners. So in the case of the city planning department in Baltimore, all of these agencies or organizations had an opportunity to provide input on the Green Network Plan. So you see a wide variety, again, of nonprofits to state, local, and federal. So we talked a little bit about the idea of identity and nature. And so when we really begin to dig into engagement with the community in this first step, once we've established our community engagement plan, we're really trying to engage all the senses and all the emotions in hearing from the community about how they experience nature, how they identify with nature, how they think of ecology or ecosystems in their city, and how that can inform this planning process in terms of their values, desires, and hopes. So we have made sure in some of the project early launch meetings, we do something that is engaging all the senses. So in our example in Atlanta, we did a series of rooms. We had a full day of a launch for the Atlanta work in establishing this urban ecology framework called Atlanta City Design Nature. And we started by bringing them into a couple different rooms to smell different items that were native plants or soils, water from some of the stream systems in there, and had them reflect on some of those smells and memories they might have. We had a different room where we asked them to tell us stories of their experience with nature in a minute. We'll get into that a little bit more. We had them give us feedback on where they experience nature, kind of a mapping exercise, not unlike what we do in a lot of planning and design work. And then a visualization exercise to help identify what they think of when they think of what nature looks like. How do they see nature when they experience it in the city? And then even we did a bumper sticker activity asking them to help us develop themes for this project, because we wanted to be able to really engage all of their senses and their ideas in helping to set the vision and goals for the project. So I talked a little bit about that nature stories room. So in this one room in that launch, we actually asked them to take some time to sit with us and tell us about their experience with nature in an audio or visual way. So we had boards where they could write their stories down, and we documented that in photos. They could draw images of their stories, they could draw on maps, and their connections and their memories of nature. And what this actually created for us was this huge toolbox of input, of visuals, and in a minute we'll have an audio to really help illustrate and catalog and collect the documentation of the individual and the community members' relationships and ideas about nature in their city. And we could use that on the website later. It became this catalog of material, just beautiful and exciting. And these emotional themes, I think I could say most of our team members, it resonated with us throughout the rest of the 2-year planning process, this first kind of launch experience. So right now, I'm going to ask Amy to pull up her audio. We have one of the audio clips.
Nature is for me, it's a freeing, healing place. Sometimes when I have a lot to deal with mentally, spiritually, I just go for a walk. Sometimes I'll walk through the city, and sometimes I'll walk through a park. Sometimes I'll walk straight through the woods. Sometimes I'll walk through the woods into another park, through a couple alleys and then into another park, like because Atlanta's set up that way. But what's cool about Atlanta is that you're never really too far from a patch of trees, a patch of grass. I don't know that healing, soothing factor would be the same if Atlanta was a strict concrete jungle. And I'm from Atlanta. And so I've always been able to do that my entire life. I've always been able to just go out, smell some grass, step into some soil, step in some dirt. You know what I mean? There's something different. You feel connected to something when you do that. And you feel connected to the rest of the world, and I think the rest of humanity, because when you step out, there's something about stepping onto soil that feels like you're standing on it with everybody else who's standing on soil somewhere.
So those sorts of stories stayed with us throughout this process. And it was a wonderful way for us to help really start to set the goals and vision for the process. So here are some of the maps that were developed based on this feedback from the community. We had the opportunity to hear from them and then start to map their feedback. So this was one of the maps created from that community feedback early on in the process, mapping first the opportunities that they had identified across the city of Atlanta for preservation, protection, special areas of green space or other areas of value. And then we also asked them to map areas that they saw as at risk that they want to consider for us through the process. So areas of rapid development, urban heat island, air quality. All of this was mapped based on those community members' feedback. So then we had an opportunity to take all that feedback and create this preliminary kind of vision map based solely on the community feedback and engagement in a series of early meetings, both with the community at large in large public meetings, as well as smaller stakeholder and technical advisory committee meetings. So it allowed for these general ideas of general kind of visionary goals to help define the process moving forward. And we would work with the city to continue to refine those. It's important to take a moment to pause and recognize that each city that we work in any city where we would be thinking about this process, is going to have very unique factors that are unique to those cities. And so when we think about starting with the existing conditions of a city and allowing that to help us also understand the impacts and the needs, we're looking at very unique circumstances. In the case of Baltimore, which is on the map on the left here, the city has experienced a lot of population loss from a high population of 900,000 people in the 1950s down to, I think, something around 60 6,000 or so at a low point. In the aftermath of the financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the city recorded 16,000 vacant parcels and 16,900 vacant buildings, so over 30,000 vacants, shown here in orange and red on the map. And so for the city of Baltimore, one of the primary intentions of establishing a green network plan was to address this issue of widespread vacancy, understanding the opportunity to also address historic systemic racism, policies like redlining, and other issues that were affecting different communities. But the opportunity in the Baltimore City case was to also look at improving equitable access to parks and rec and other benefits of green space using this plan as a springboard, as well as understanding sustainable economic development. In the case of Atlanta, on the right-hand side of the screen, it was a very different starting point for the city of Atlanta. A tree survey in 2008 and 2014 revealed 42% canopy coverage across the city of Atlanta. That is a significant mature tree canopy for a city of its size and age. And it results in the nickname that many nicknames for Atlanta. One of them is City in a Forest. But there had been growing concern about the loss of this significant tree canopy resource with expected nation economic development and population growth. And so the city of Atlanta had understood, based on a survey done by the Atlanta Regional Council in 2015, that Atlanta was expecting an increase of 1.3 million people just inside the city proper in the next 30 years. So the city wanted to find a way to balance and allow for population growth and development to occur, but also preserve that important resource and defining quality of the city of Atlanta with the tree resource and the canopy. So in both cases, the city had very different kind of starting points and factors at play, but those both played into also understanding the existing needs of the community. But as we looked at the community needs and we started to map that, we also start to do our own internal development of mapping and understanding the data of existing conditions to help establish, again, this narrative of place associated with ecology. In building the ecological narrative, we also start by examining historical ecological narratives, like and including data about geology, rivers and streams, and wetlands. Meadows, remnant forest patches, biodiversity inherent in all of these systems. And we're looking both at the city scale and also at the regional ecological connections that are part of that. We think about the historic programs and plans and other impacts of old policies on the city and how that has impacted both development patterns and resource protection or loss patterns. We're thinking about the legacy resources, what was there historically, as well as what is found today. And all of this is helping us establish this grounding in an understanding of the ecological conditions underlying the city. And this is just the very beginning of the data analysis process, but starting again to begin with the story of the conditions and the emotional connections of our time and place in the landscape. So that's how we wanted to start with this conversation. We want these to be opportunities for all of us to discuss. So I'm going to close now, just reviewing that we started today with this session really focused on the first two steps of this process. In about 2 weeks, we will dig deeper into this data analysis and alternative scenarios of potential change and impact on systems. That's how we'll kind of dive into the process next. And then 3 weeks or 4 weeks from now, we will look at that final development of the final ecological framework and how does pilot projects and funding and implementation potential play into the discussion in the planning process. And again, thinking, of course, of how community engagement is integrated throughout, and that this is an iterative dialogue towards a more holistic approach. So with that, I'll wrap it up. And here are some resources that are links to many of the projects that I mentioned today, as well as some other resources. And then we'll open it up for some questions and dialogue. I think Aiman has been keeping track of the questions in the chat box. And maybe even Aiman and I will have some dialogue if you guys are shy or if we get through your questions quickly.
Yes. Hi, Jen. I got a few questions in the box now, but I'd encourage folks to please feel free to type on the question box on the right. If you click the square with a diagonal line, it'll pop out, and please feel free to enter some questions. We'll really appreciate your thoughts and questions and discussion from the group at large. So first question I see here, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, or more of a statement that maybe we can discuss a little further, is the idea that in addition to ecological systems having functions that are useful to us, how important it is to retain an overriding respect for the intrinsic value and legitimacy of nature, irrespective of benefits to humans. And then they reference Otto Leopold, the land ethic, other environmental ethics thinkers, and they're expressing the idea that it's easy to overlook in the nitty-gritty of planning. It can be easy to overlook the intrinsic value of nature. So I don't know if you want to say a few words on that thought at large, or how it's influenced some of the work that you've been describing previously.
Absolutely. And then, Aiman, I'm sure you too have some ideas or feedback on that. That is absolutely true. I think in the ideal world, we would be able to rely solely on really celebrating the intrinsic value of nature, and also the importance of those as functioning systems that we have had enormous impacts on. If we could pull back and allow for them to function. But we are indeed impacting them greatly. And we are in many cases needing to find ways of communicating to others both the intrinsic value and also how others relate to those systems and can help preserve and protect them by understanding how they also benefit from those. But you're right, it is absolutely important. And I think that's why we start with those emotional conversations about experiences in nature, because they aren't always about benefits per se, but about these moments of wonder and that these systems exist and that are very sensitive to the impacts that we can have on them. Aiman, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Sure, I'll just add the we'll probably delve into what I'm about to allude to in some of the future episodes, but the point that you bring up, when we kind of structure our analysis and ways of looking at the different layers of this system, we've definitely reflected on that idea and incorporated it in the sense of ecosystem services having functions that are important to humans as one bucket or one aspect of analysis. But then we always make sure to while biodiversity supports all of those things, and obviously none of us would be alive without the biodiversity of the world around us, and including in our urban systems, we delve deeply into analysis of the value and function and needs of biodiversity in its own right, knowing that it then supports these other services and these interactions and life of the city for people that we're speaking of. But we do make sure to delve into that in its own right also.
Yes, those images of those wildlife species were key to part of that biodiversity analysis that I showed early on in the slide deck today.
So a couple other questions here. One from a student. So I have an engineering student. This is a topic that I'm particularly passionate about. As someone who is an environmental engineering student, how can I use my knowledge to get involved and help?
Absolutely. Well, I think environmental engineering, Biohabitats, we have a nice proportion of our team are environmental engineers. Most of them are water resource engineers or agricultural engineers by training. There are so many aspects that are about kind of the function and the interrelationship of these systems, and the understanding that engineers can bring to that is very valuable. And frankly, I think all of us benefit from a wide understanding and the opportunity to speak in dialogue with different design professions when we get into this work. So you may understand more specifics of the hydrologic function that are very important for us to think about the impacts of flooding on different neighborhoods or communities within the city scale approach, or the importance of integration of green stormwater infrastructure as part of understanding the kind of green network plan opportunities and benefits. So plenty of ways to get engaged. And I think really it's important for all of us to bring our depth of expertise and then learn and talk across disciplines to all be stronger in this work.
We have another interesting question here. Is there a typical event or series of events that prompts a city to engage in this type of formal integrated planning? Do many cities already have plans like this in place?
That's a great question. What we're seeing is that a lot of cities have a comprehensive planning, and they do that on, maybe a decade basis or less. I guess if changes are happening in terms of economics, or, we saw a lot of brownfield redevelopment work going on in the 2007, 2010 time. There are events like, I think, the recession years of 2007, 2009 that really allow for a pause and for cities to kind of take stock of things. There are then events that I think are specific to different cities due to whatever might be changing in those cities with regard to population growth, like we saw in Atlanta. I think a lot of cities are starting to think more about this, and we're seeing more opportunities, whether it comes out of city planning or parks and recreation, thinking about kind of citywide park planning, but allowing for it to think about these networks of ecology integrated into open space. It's coming in a lot of different ways in different places, but I think we're seeing increased interest and more cities looking for resiliency planning approaches that might include this. There are other ways too, where there may be, for different reasons, a city needs to address other issues associated with equity or access, like housing or education or access to food, and those things may be more of a priority depending on what's happening in a city. Those can be integrated into these processes as well, or maybe standalone efforts. So it comes in a variety of ways, and I think we look forward to working with more cities to do what we were doing in Atlanta and Baltimore.
So here's another question here. Was there a dream big option in these plans where there was a less constrained or unconstrained visioning, like removing large infrastructure or something which seems too big but is only so until it's on a plan? So maybe alluding to how some of these larger, more comprehensive visions can perhaps open windows of possibility for the city and the community.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of the dream big visioning happening in the first part of the process, in the first few months, maybe first 6 months. And a lot of those early stakeholder mapping exercises and storytelling exercises, we did ask people to think aspirationally and think big about what could be the future of their city and how nature exists or appears or is accessed in their city. So yes, I think we'll show in the next episode a bit about these alternative scenarios. That was one step we took in kind of visioning in Atlanta. And that allowed for us to really think outside the box and think about these really broad gestures to help kind of inform the process. And of course, yes, they were shifted and they continued to evolve as the refinement occurred. But we did have those moments to think about how we might change large parts of the infrastructure, perhaps, like large road networks. What does that mean to green large road networks and things like that? There have been over the years talk in the city of Baltimore. We have the Interstate 83 cuts through the center of the city and is over one of our large stream corridors. And there have been moments over the last couple of decades where there's been talk of, what if we removed I-83 and daylit that street system again. It's above ground for part of it, and then it gets piped as it enters towards the center of the city and into the harbor. And so those visions actually continue to kind of pop up every so often in conversation. So it does allow us to dream big.
Would you mind maybe talking a little bit about, you talked earlier about the city as a collaborator. Would you say something about maybe engagement with the community and our relationships with city government, relationships with the community, how maybe different models of how those can work and have worked on some of these projects that you described?
Absolutely. Thanks, Aiman. Yes, that takes a variety of forms. So in many cases, cities have very established relationships with communities through the planning department. In the city of Baltimore, for instance, in our work on the Green Network Plan, the city planning department actually took the lead in community engagement, and we were, in essence, a support to the city in that process, because they had neighborhood representation in each sector of the city through the planning department. And so that was a wonderful existing relationship and network of relationships that this plan could build on and support, but it allowed for the city to take the lead because those relationships existed and were so strong with the dialogue that had been cultivated over years. In the case of Atlanta, it was a very different model. There was a lot of role that the city played in the public engagement process, but the team had a larger role in establishing the process of engagement, the types of meetings. We worked with the city to determine the locations of the meetings, and then had a different role in sort of facilitating those discussions. So it can take a lot of different forms. And I think what I highlighted at the beginning of the talk about this importance of really having a collaborative, dialogue-heavy relationship with the planning agency or whoever the client is that we are constantly in discussion about what makes the most sense to have the most impact in making this inclusive and engaging to the community at large. And I think we all know this as planners, those of us who are in the planning side of things or in the consulting side of things. We also have to be very cognizant of meeting fatigue and engagement fatigue. A lot of these community members have probably been engaged in a lot of community meetings over the past decade with regard to all sorts of plans or designs that are in play. And so we are cognizant of that and try to balance that with the need to make sure that the community members feel they're heard and engaged in this process.
Thanks. Building on the dream big question and brief discussion, can you say a word about involvement and participation of the community and public engagement in these dream big types of discussions, and then maybe the management of expectations of the nitty gritty of what's needed and achievable versus potentially longer term, larger scale visions of how the city might transform dramatically?
Sure. That does go back to partially this very strong collaborative relationship that we build with the client, the city agency or organization or series of agencies. It is important, I think, that we are communicating, as I've said, early and often with the community and these stakeholder and technical advisory groups, but we're also always trying to explain very transparently and manage expectations for what the potential impact and potential role this plan has in the larger city scheme of items that are going to be covered and projects that will be supported. We had I think in all the cases that we worked on these types of projects, community members are going to ask, is this just going to be another plan? And how is this really going to benefit my community if you're adding more green space in an area where the DPW can't afford to take care of the green space we have right now? And those are really important questions that we're glad that people are raising at the onset and throughout the process. And we take those seriously and try to respond in kind with a with the city department or planning department to be honest about how this falls into the larger plans and kind of agenda items of the mayor or the planning agency, so that we're honest and open. But I will say, and we'll get into this in one of the later episodes, what I think is very powerful about the plans and the approach that these cities have taken is that they understand the importance of seeing real life change come out of these. And so in the case of Baltimore City, the Green Network Plan resulted in some pilot project locations that had some energy moving them forward in parallel with us finalizing the plan. So the city community members were going to see a result, some sort of output of this that they could experience. And we could address questions about like maintenance and those sorts of things, opportunities for jobs and the need for jobs and more engagement for the community and some of their needs by exploring alternative types of opportunities that could be woven into the final plan, like green jobs, plans or programs that could start to be implemented. So we really value all of those moments where we can think with the community, and we do try to manage expectations and sort of ground ourselves in what is practical and feasible in the short term and what can still be thought of as long-term visions for the community.
Can you say a word, you know, some of the examples we've talked about are fairly large cities. So we have a question that's interested in the idea of smaller communities, how you might convince them to invest in this type of planning, and how this urban ecology framework planning model could translate to a smaller scale or smaller scale communities.
Absolutely. This is definitely scalable. We've actually taken this model and used it for neighborhood scale work. I was part of a team that did a project in a neighborhood in Detroit where we could apply the same idea at the scale of a neighborhood, kind of a larger neighborhood concept within the city. So it can be scaled up or down, and then it is really personalized by the landscape, by the systems at play and the needs that the community hopes to meet. With regard to funding and opportunities for making this possible in a smaller city, I think we have seen a lot of change over the last 12 months or more, maybe 14 months now, with regard to the understanding of the value of access to, engagement with, and experience adjacent to or viewing of green space, the value of our relationship to open space, to accessing and being outside. Again, there is that intrinsic value of nature, but there is a value in terms of public health, in terms of even healing after medical surgeries. There's a lot of evidence now of the benefits that humans have in accessing nature, whether it's just in seeing it or in walking through it, forest bathing, if you will. There are, I think, opportunities to hold on to that and to find ways of applying funding to increasing public health disparities and other types of equity and inclusivity disparities in communities, and also think about the impacts of climate change and resiliency, and whether that's water management and flooding, and how do we think of our green infrastructure in our city as a way to help manage some of those impacts. So there are, I think, some big themes in the world that can be important to any community at any scale. And I think there are different funding mechanisms coming into play associated with climate change and with green space and open space access and equity and inclusion.
You know, Jennifer, this question makes me think about some discussions we've had in the past about you know, taking, you know, whether it be an existing plan type or an existing planning initiative, and then you know, the idea of scaling it up conceptually or holistically in terms of what we're looking at. You know, I know there's some work that you're doing right now with some communities that are really focused on trail implementation. You know, I've been doing some work recently with some communities who are using some grant money to you know, just really focus in on their tree canopy and their tree canopy statistics, and where you know, where some of the best and most equitable and most useful places might be for new tree planting initiatives. So I don't know if you want to say a word about, you know, the idea of taking some of these smaller scale projects that, maybe even on paper, it might seem like a small, very more narrow kind of focus, and then bringing some of this landscape ecology context into what might be more focused on infrastructure, or taking a step back and considering kind of the context of that community and regional connections.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's exactly right. There may be a funding mechanism that's solely focused on trails, but the idea is that we are really thinking, and we can help bring this thinking into the dialogue of what are all the other benefits, that cascading impact that also relate to that trail implementation, but have these broader impacts associated with ecological health or public health or economic development potential, or access and equity. So we can take that seed of an opportunity that has a funding source, but then we can really expand the impact and the potential for impact to a broader understanding. And that's the power and the excitement in my mind for landscape ecology as the foundational part of the discussion, is that it's about patterns and processes and connections, and really seeing the broader picture and the impacts and relationships we have at different scales, even if we're only focused on a small town or city or neighborhood or the city itself. Hi, Amy, I see you're back.
I'm back, and I even remembered to unmute myself. We are just about out of time, so I wanted to thank you, Jennifer and Aiman, for taking the time to lead this webinar today. It was so interesting, and I want to thank all of you for attending. The next two webinars will be on May 19th and June 2nd. And June 5th is World Environment Day, and that will launch the decade on what the UN has declared to be the decade on ecosystem restoration. So it's my hope that with that, there will be a lot more discussions about topics related to biodiversity, and we look forward to hosting many more Habitat Happy Hours. If you have ideas, things you'd love for us to address in them, you want to be part of one, my email contact information will be in that follow-up email to you. Please let me know, reach out, let's connect, and let's keep having happy hours and keep talking. Thanks to all of you. Be well.